This video is sponsored by Supremacy 1914. Check it out via the link in the description. The Chinese Empire of the 19th century was not ruled by the Chinese. Instead, it was ruled by the Qing, a dynasty of foreign Manchus, a Tungusic people with ancestry in Siberia. Foreign rule over China was not unusual, but whenever foreigners did rule the country, they were always heavily outnumbered by their Chinese subjects. At the time of the Qing conquest, there were only 3 Manchus per 1,000 Chinese, so to maintain their occupation, the Manchus kept themselves separate from their subjects. Many lived in garrison cities, walled-off Manchu-exclusive districts inside of Chinese cities. But the Manchus were not the only foreigners in China. Europeans had been trading there for centuries. Among those foreign traders were the British, who, in spite of being latecomers to the China trade, had the greatest appetite for Chinese goods, especially tea. So in 1773, Britain sent the Macartney Embassy to meet with the Emperor of China. Its goals were to open more ports to foreign trade, to establish a permanent embassy in the capital of Peking, the cession of a small island for a British colony, and to end the trade restrictions in the only open trading port at Canton. Unfortunately, the embassy suffered from serious culture shock. The biggest issue was over the kowtow, the low bow to the ground expected of all tribute missions. But the way the British saw it, they weren't sending a tribute mission. Their ambassadors were representatives of a free, proud, and independent people, entitled to negotiate with the Chinese as equals. This attitude offended the Qing considerably. So after a rush meeting between the embassy and the emperor, where a compromised sort of half kowtow was performed, they were rushed out of the capital, and the Qing emperor sent an imperious and insulting letter to the King of England. But the leader of the embassy, Macartney, didn't just take all of that sitting down. He wrote to the British public, explaining that China was nothing like the supreme global power most had imagined. That China was, in fact, economically backwards, militarily weak, and critically unstable. He claimed that it would only take a couple of frigates to destroy the entire Chinese navy and blockade her rich coastal provinces, that the native Han Chinese resented their Manchu overlords, and that they would soon rise up in rebellion against them, tearing the empire apart. All of this was written by a man who had only been in the country for a couple of months. You would be forgiven for thinking that all of this smacked of wounded pride, which was certainly a factor. But the thing is, Macartney was right. 3 years later, China was in revolt. So you can call me Ezekiel. And this is the First Opium War. One of the Opium War's many long-term consequences would be the continued growth and expansion of the British Empire, who's one of the key players in today's sponsor, Supremacy 1914, the free multiplayer real-time grand strategy game set in World War I. In Supremacy 1914, you'll take control of one of many nations across the world, and battle up to 500 players for control of it. Games can last for weeks, as your armies move and economy and technology advances in real time. All of this means that to win, you'll need to use all of the tools at your disposal, from infantry and cavalry to tanks and airplanes, all of which can be researched and enhanced via the tech tree featuring over 120 different units. But force alone won't be enough to win. My favorite part of any grand strategy game is conducting diplomacy with other players. So with dozens or even hundreds of other players in your match, you'll have a lot of people to talk to, with whom you'll need to make the right alliances, and even more importantly, the right enemies in order to win. Supremacy 1914 is available on both PC and mobile devices, so click our exclusive link in the description to get 15,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription time for free. This offer is only available for a limited time though, so take advantage before it's gone. And now, back to the video. In 1796, central China was struck by the massive White Lotus Rebellion, named for its leadership in the secret millenarian cult who believed that the Buddha was about to return to Earth. To the militaristic Qing, the operation to restore order should have been quick and easy, but the campaign instead devolved into a decade-long war of attrition that nearly bankrupted the empire. You see, former Qing rulers had committed themselves to never raising land taxes, and the Chinese tradition of filial piety made it impossible for any Chinese emperor to break their ancestors' promises. These financial constraints prevented the Qing from supporting a bureaucracy large enough to manage their empire. What little bureaucracy the Qing did have was tremendously corrupt, and oppressed the Chinese people in acts of shocking excess. But now, with rebellion ravaging central China, the corruption was kicked into overdrive. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers supposedly raised to fight the rebellion only existed on the payrolls, and the money and equipment meant for these ghost soldiers then disappeared into the mandarins' pockets. Real soldiers weren't spared either, since officers would extract wealth from them by embezzling their death benefits, which were supposed to go to supporting the dead soldiers' families. Some officers even intentionally got men under their command killed so they could steal more benefits. More than half of the massive fortune spent putting down the rebellion would be lost to corruption. All of this further oppressed the Chinese people, forcing them into the ranks of the rebellion. This vicious cycle of rebellion, corruption, oppression, and more rebellion extended the war for years. By the turn of the 19th century, China's treasuries were empty, and the rebellion was still raging. And that wasn't even the end of China's problems. As White Lotuses and corrupt officials rampaged through central China, a Chinese mercenary fleet returned from supporting a failed rebellion in Vietnam. This fleet immediately proceeded to pirate the Chinese coast. In a process similar to that which grew the White Lotus Rebellion, the more they pirated, the more coastal people were forced to turn to piracy to earn a living, creating another vicious cycle of lawlessness. This pirate armada was soon united into a massive pirate confederation under a kick-ass pirate queen, who's not the subject of today's video, so whose story we can't get into here. The Chinese people had not fought a major naval campaign in over 100 years, and their Qing rulers were more closely related to horse nomads than seafarers, making China even less capable of waging a war on the seas. But after many years of war and strife, the White Lotuses would be violently put down in 1804, while the pirate problem would be concluded more peacefully when the Qing government offered amnesty to the crews and cushy government jobs to their leaders, an offer most would accept by 1810. So after much carnage, peace was finally restored to China. China was not the only global center eating itself alive at the time. Europe spent its turn of the 19th century convulsed by the French Revolutionary and later Napoleonic Wars. It is from these conflicts that our other great belligerent, Britain, emerged victorious. The wars saw the British Empire expand to include new profitable colonies around the world, and left Britain with the world's most powerful navy to guard them. This new and improved British Empire lorded over a quarter of the world's population, almost as many people as who lived in China. The Qing, on the other hand, gained nothing from their conflicts, except for a scarred interior and an empty treasury. The government was forced to slash spending across the board just to remain solvent, including spending on the military, meaning that it would remain dangerously obsolete for decades to come. And amidst all of this, a new problem started to reveal itself: opium. Opium first reached China through Dutch traders who cultivated it in their colony on Java. The Dutch would then sell this opium to the Chinese, who liked to mix it with tobacco and smoke it. The Qing government banned the drug in 1729, but the ban was hardly enforced. But, at the very least, the Chinese didn't like opium that much, so it never became a problem. Or at least it never became a problem until the British got involved. India was the crown jewel of the British Empire, conquered and ruled by a publicly traded corporation, the Honourable East India Company. Every Briton felt pride in their rule over India, but that pride hid an unfortunate truth. The colony was horrifically unprofitable. If not for the China trade, which the EIC also had a monopoly over, the company would have gone bankrupt long ago. But, luckily for the company and its shareholders, it was discovered in the 1730s that the opium poppy grew very well in India, and that the Chinese provided a small but reliable market for it. The only catch was that the drug was illegal in China, and the EIC didn't want to risk their legal trade by smuggling. So the EIC's business was to legally grow their opium in India, sell it to private smuggling operations outside of China, and to let the smugglers take on the moral hazard. The century that followed would see opium evolve into a luxury for China's elites, with the Chinese specifically preferring British-grown opium because they associated foreign goods with quality and prestige. But the real explosion came in the 1820s. In that decade, private farmers and independent states began to grow their own opium to compete with the EIC. After failing to block their exports, the company started a price war by ramping up production so as to drive down the prices, hoping that the low prices would drive their competitors out of business. The company also, very foolishly, purchased all of their competitors' opium in order to gain more market share. While it was now technically true that it put the EIC in control of the vast majority of the opium market, it also gave their competitors the capital and incentive they needed to increase their own production. These misguided attempts at economic warfare combined to cause a massive glut in the opium supply, lowering the price of the drug in China. What was once a luxury only available to the rich was now in reach of China's numerous poor, creating a massive and addicted market. And in case you're wondering, no, none of this drove any of the company's competitors out of business. By the end of the 1820s, opium made up more than half of British exports to China. This new stream of trade was enough to correct a long-running trade imbalance that had in the past hemorrhaged Britain's bullion reserves. It was this growing drug trade that would soon capture the attention of both British and Chinese officials. In 1816, the British would make another attempt to negotiate trade concessions from China. This attempt, the Amherst Embassy, failed for similar reasons as Macartney had, with the kowtow once again rearing its ugly head. Funnily enough, not only did the Amherst Embassy fail to accomplish anything, but the boat carrying everyone home hit a rock and sank. This prompted the British to try a new strategy for opening up China. They were going to ignore the government and just unilaterally send an expedition to explore the coast north of Canton. This expedition got as far as Korea and found the Chinese people along the way to be remarkably friendly. While local officials would always ask the British to leave, they only ever did so in the politest terms, and made clear that the only reason for their insistence was that they didn't want to get in trouble with the government. The reason why exploring north of Canton was significant is that foreign trade in China was restricted to the city's port. There, foreign traders could only do business part of the year, and only through the Han trade monopoly. By 1830, the British trade community got so sick of this system, and their government's failure to change it, that they decided to take action themselves. First by sending a letter to their government asking it to resort to force to extract trade concessions, and then by expanding their small factory through land reclamation. They succeeded in gaining a few feet of ground, and even planted a shrubbery on it. This shrub was the source of an absolutely unreasonable amount of pride on the part of the merchants. But the thing is, the Chinese had specifically asked the merchants not to do any of this, so while they were away in Macau for the off-season, the Chinese broke into the factory, tore up the shrubbery, and sank the reclaimed land. Another insult came when allegedly, a Chinese official turned his back on a portrait of King George IV. The merchants of Canton sent another letter to the British government, complaining about the violent entry into their factory, insults to their king, and worst of all, the destruction of their beloved shrubbery. So leave a tree emoji in the comments to make clear just how seriously we take the loss of our beloved shrub. But, unfortunately for our horticulturalist merchants and their allies in the Knights Who Say Ni,
we want a shrubbery!
The government ignored their request. For one, it was ridiculous, but also the government was distracted by a much more serious matter, because in 1832, the Honorable East India Company's monopoly on the China trade was revoked, putting it into the hands of a new government position called the Chief Superintendent of Trade. However, the Chief Superintendent of Trade was practically a ceremonial position, lacking any real diplomatic, economic, or legal powers. But that didn't stop its office holders from bringing China and Britain to the brink of war on two separate occasions. The The first chief superintendent of trade would be the highly unqualified William John Napier, who had no experience with China, trade, or diplomacy, but was a ravenous warhawk with great private ambitions in China. Napier's story doesn't really go anywhere, so in brief, as soon as he arrived, he acted as belligerently as possible towards the Chinese, became shocked when they no longer wanted to talk to him, and then decided that his most reasonable course of action would be to put up posters throughout the streets of Canton denouncing its officials. This prompted the Chinese to initiate their own counter-poster campaign calling for Napier's execution, shutting down all trade with Britain and besieging the British factory with Napier inside. Gunboats were then called in to break the siege, but they first had to fight through 2 coastal forts guarding Canton. While the ships were able to defeat the forts at the cost of 2 dead and 9 wounded, bad weather and river blockages made it impossible for them to relieve the factory, leaving Napier plain out of luck. By this point, even the most hawkish traders were upset with Napier, so with even his own closest allies hounding him, Napier gave up and left Canton. Trade was then reopened with the British, restoring the status quo. 2 weeks later, Napier got sick and died. By the middle of the 1830s, China's economy entered into a depression, making life worse for everyone and further reducing the government's already insufficient tax revenues. All of this was exacerbated by a bullion crisis, caused in part by the trade imbalances with the foreigners, much of it thanks to China's growing need for opium. The situation got so bad that the Chinese began to seriously consider opium legalization. After all, past attempts to enforce the ban had been failures, so why not return this growing population of criminals to the legal fold and tax their addiction? That could at least help solve some of the nation's financial problems, and even help solve the bullion crisis by forbidding the legal purchase of opium with silver, keeping the precious metal in the country. This possible solution was also paired with a far more cooperative British representative. In 1836, there was a new chief superintendent of trade in China, Captain Charles Eliot. He was much more qualified for the job than Napier, with experience reining in slave owners back when slavery was still legal in Britain. Now he would put those skills to use reining in opium smugglers. Eliot's first move was to establish a positive relationship with his Chinese counterparts, who liked him so much that they granted him the Chinese name, Righteous Law. This annoyed the more hawkish members of the trade community, but since the chief superintendent of trade still had no legal powers, they pretty much ignored him. In the late 1830s, the Chinese government made its decision on opium legalization. The decision was no. Not only that, but the government chose to pursue the opposite policy of cracking down on the opium trade. This worried Eliot, who feared it could bring the Chinese into conflict with the British, but Britain's official policy on the matter was that if any British subjects were caught violating Chinese law, they were to be left to their fate. By the end of 1838, it was looking like the Chinese crackdown would prove decisive and end the opium trade for good. Better yet, the foreign community was not overly antagonized. The worst of it was an exchange of fire between Chinese officials and opium smugglers, but since the smugglers were acting outside of the law, the Western governments didn't care. But all of this would change when the Chinese made a provocation. On December 12th, Chinese officials erected a gallows outside of the foreign factory district. Their plan was to execute an opium dealer in front of the foreign traders, who had certainly supplied him. This outraged certain Western sailors, who marched out and forcibly deconstructed the gallows. Neither the Chinese soldiers guarding it nor the onlookers did anything to stop them. But the sailors then went further and pushed their way into the crowd, which started a riot. Horribly outnumbered, the sailors ran back to their factory, which the rioters assaulted with bricks and rocks. This scene only ended when Chinese soldiers arrived to disperse the crowd. Charles Eliot arrived that night with 120 armed sailors. He was outraged by his people's actions in stopping the Chinese execution. While it was in poor taste, the Chinese undoubtedly had the right to do it. In March of 1839, the crackdown became even more intense, escalating to mass arrests and, very dangerously, the targeting of the foreign trade community. On the 18th of that month, Chinese officials demanded that foreign merchants in the factory district surrender all of their opium stocks within 3 days. After much discussion, the British agreed to surrender 1,000 chests, but that wasn't anywhere near their full supply, and everyone knew it. So after the deadline passed, the Chinese besieged the factory, trapping 350 British, Americans, Dutch, and Parsees inside. Charles Eliot was tremendously upset by this situation. He imagined that the traders were on the brink of starvation after days of siege. But in reality, the factories were well stocked since they had long since become used to Chinese sieges. They also had new supplies coming in from friendly Chinese locals, who, through years of trade, had many friends in the foreign community. But reality wouldn't stop Charles Eliot from proposing a daring plan. One that would make everyone happy, but put his own career at risk. He was going to buy every last chest of opium from the merchants, hand them all over to the Chinese, and make the British government pay for it. When he explained this plan to the merchants, they didn't believe him. The deal was just too good to be true. Was Eliot really about to get them all off the hook for their crimes and buy their entire supply of very illegal drugs at full price? But when Eliot confirmed that that's exactly what he wanted to do, they all jumped on his deal. Even the American merchants got in on the action. As a result, over 20,000 chests of opium, worth £2 million, or over $300 million today, were surrendered to Eliot, who in turn began to transfer it to the Chinese. This purchase briefly made Queen Victoria the single largest holder of opium in history. The only problem was that as Chief Superintendent of Trade, Charles Eliot did not have the power to do any of this, and was in violation of his own government's policy of leaving the traders to their fate. But maybe it was just enough to prevent a tragedy. Everything then unraveled because of a misunderstanding and an overreaction. Even as the first shipments of opium were delivered into Chinese hands, the Chinese had yet to lift their siege of the factory. While they probably weren't prolonging the siege out of malice, it was not the smartest thing to do. The way Charles Eliot saw it, he had just put his career on the line to give the Chinese everything they wanted. And this is how they repaid him? With nothing? In a fateful move, Eliot sends a letter back to Britain, asking for a war fleet. And then, as the letter makes its months-long journey back to England, the Chinese lift the siege. But it was too late, because back in Britain, the government was taking Eliot's request very seriously. After all, the past calls for war were made by uppity merchants, opium smugglers, and hawkish political appointees. Eliot was well respected and considered quite dovish, so if he was asking for a war fleet, the situation must have been serious. Eliot also made the political situation uniquely favorable to war. The British government was buried in debt from both the Napoleonic Wars and its recent emancipation of the slaves. There was just no money left over for the opium merchants. Or at least there wasn't any money left in Britain. So why not use the expedition Eliot had asked for to force the Chinese to pay for it? Plus, the British had been trying for decades to extract trade concessions from China peacefully, so why not also take this opportunity to win those concessions by force? The arguments for war were just too strong. The government sent Eliot his fleet. The First Opium War was set in motion. Back in China, Eliot was preparing for war. After the siege of the factory was lifted, he brought all of the merchants to the safety of Portuguese Macau, but bored sailors caused more problems when they got themselves into a brawl with nearby Chinese villagers, accidentally killing one of them. The Chinese wanted the sailors handed over, but having likely started a war with China, Eliot chose not to comply. Instead, he tried the sailors himself, found them guilty, and shipped them back to England to serve a term of harsh labor. But, since the Chief Superintendent of Trade still had no legal authority, the sailors were freed as soon as they arrived. Infuriated by this, the Chinese cut off supplies to Macau, and applied pressure on the Portuguese, who controlled the city, to stop giving refuge to the British. In order to avoid creating a diplomatic incident with Britain's long-term ally, Eliot led the British out of the city to the safety of the barren islands of Hong Kong. Shortly after abandoning Macau, the first British warship, the HMS Village, arrived, which Eliot ordered to begin a blockade of Canton. Soon after, a merchant ship refitted for war at its captain's own expense arrived too, and conducted an attack alongside some smaller boats against Chinese ships blockading Hong Kong. This Battle of Kowloon would be the first combat action of the war, and ended in total British victory. A month later, another battle between 29 war junks and 2 British warships began when a British ship tried running Eliot's blockade on Canton. Wanting to reassert control over Canton's waters, the Chinese tried to protect its way into port. But, in spite of outnumbering the British over 10-1, the Chinese fleet was annihilated by the 2 British warships, only inflicting a single casualty, a wound on the British. British military superiority was making itself felt even before the actual expedition fleet arrived. And that's where we'll leave our 2 belligerents, skirmishing before the expeditionary fleet arrives to carry the Opium War into full swing. Will a single British fleet be enough to beat the power of the entire Chinese Empire? Will Charles Eliot continue to screw things up for the British? And will a bunch of angry villagers put up better resistance to the British than the actual Chinese military? Find out all of this and more in part 2, which, when it's out, you'll be able to watch by clicking the link on the top right of your screen. This video was funded by British opium smugglers, from their immense profits made by ruining an entire nation, including both Josiah and Pater, and by this video's sponsor, Supremacy 1914, the free online PvP strategy game set during World War I. Formulate and implement your strategy as you battle for supremacy across the world. Use our exclusive code in the description to get 15,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription time for free. But this offer ends soon, so take advantage before it's gone. Links to Supremacy 1914 and where you can support us directly are in the description. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. I'll see you in part 2.
Fine cruelle, opium, oiseau menteur, c'est toi qui nous révèles